My name is Margaret. I am 74 years old this year. And if you are listening to me right now, maybe you are much younger than I am. Or maybe you are at what people often call a turning point age. I just want you to know one thing from the very beginning. It took me nearly my entire life to understand that many of the things we believe about growing old are not actually true. When I was young, I grew up with a very clear story about life. You study, you work, you fall in love, you get married, you build a family, and then at some point when your body starts to slow down, when desire is no longer the same as before, life slows down with it. It becomes smaller. No one says it out loud, but everyone seems to understand that the years after 60 are years of less. Less passion, less connection, less feeling needed. I believed that for so long that I never questioned it. I carried it with me as an obvious truth, like the sun rising every morning. And then when my husband passed away, just after I turned 67, that belief suddenly became a very real fear. I remember those first days after the funeral so clearly. The house was so quiet, I could hear the wall clock ticking with every second. I sat there and thought, this is it. This part of my life ends here. It was not just about sex. It was about closeness, about having someone touch your hand in a familiar way, about looking at someone and knowing there is a person in this world who understands you without you having to explain yourself. I thought that when those things disappeared, connection disappeared with them. And I am ashamed to admit it, but there were moments when I wondered if something was wrong with me, if other women my age had figured out how to keep a flame alive that I had somehow lost. No one prepared me for that emptiness. No one told me that silence could be that frightening, and no one told me that that silence was not the end. It took me a very long time to realize that what hurt me was not the absence of sex, but the story I had believed about it. I believed that intimacy and sex were the same thing, that if one disappeared, the other disappeared too. But that is what society told us, not what our bodies or our hearts were actually saying. My body changed, yes, I do not deny that. My energy is not what it used to be. Sensations that were once intense are now softer, slower. Hormones change, and with them, the way I experience desire, the way I experience myself. And as a woman, I have to be honest and say that no one tells us how quiet everything can become inside. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is just different. For a long time, I thought that different meant wrong. I thought I needed to fix it, to go back to the way things were. But you cannot turn back time, and the more you try, the more you feel like you are failing. Until one day, sitting alone in my backyard garden, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, I suddenly realized that my body was not betraying me. It was simply telling me that I needed a different way of living. That was the first moment I stopped fighting myself. I began to understand that the loneliness I had feared for so long did not truly come from the lack of physical closeness. It came from not feeling seen, not being heard, not being recognized as someone who still exists and still matters. And that does not depend on whether or not you are having sex. It depends on whether you are willing to connect in new ways. I started talking more with my friends, not polite conversations, but real ones, about fear, about regret, about things we never dared to say when we were younger because we were too busy chasing life. And I was surprised to realize that I felt closer than ever before. No need to take off clothes, just the need to take off masks. I also learned that pleasure does not disappear. It only changes form. When you are young, pleasure is fast, intense, demanding. When you grow older, it becomes more subtle. An old song playing on the radio, morning sunlight coming through the window, a hug that lasts a few seconds longer. These things fill me in ways I never noticed before, and for the first time in many years, I began to feel that I was still alive. Not in the way society defines it, but in my own way. I wish someone had told me this earlier. I wish that at 40 or 50, I had known that life does not shrink when certain doors close. It simply moves into different rooms. But back then, I was not ready to hear it. And maybe you only hear this when you truly need it. There is another thing that took me a long time to accept. Wanting something when you are older is not selfish, and it is certainly not shameful. When you live long enough in a society that constantly reminds you that at this age you should settle, you begin to censor yourself. You stop allowing yourself to want more. You stop saying out loud that you still long for joy, warmth, the feeling of being moved. No one forbids you. You forbid yourself, because you do not want to be seen as someone who does not know their place. I remember once when I was around 70, I told someone I knew that I was thinking about traveling alone. She looked at me for a long moment and smiled, half joking, half serious, and said, "At your age, where would you even want to go?" It was not meant to be cruel, but it stayed with me for days. I sat in my car, looking at the steering wheel, and thought, yes, where would I want to go? And what surprised me was, I still wanted to go. I still wanted to see places I had never been. I still wanted to wake up in a strange city, drink coffee on an unfamiliar street corner, and feel that I was alive in that moment. We often think desire is only tied to sex, but desire is much larger than that. It is the desire to experience, to learn, to try, to feel. And if you silence all of that just because one part of your body has changed, you miss so much of what later life can offer. There was a time when I hated being alone. I hated long evenings with no one sitting across from me at the table. I turned on the television just to have voices in the house. But slowly I learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. They are not the same, even though we often use the words interchangeably. There were days when I was alone but felt completely full. I sat on the porch, listened to the birds, felt the wind on my skin, and lacked nothing. And there were moments when I was surrounded by people and felt painfully empty. After my husband died, I thought that without a romantic relationship, my life would be nothing but empty spaces. But it turned out those spaces were exactly where other things could enter. Deeper friendships, more honest connections. Conversations no longer centered around obligation, but around who we truly are. I have friends who call me just to ask, "How are you today?" Not because they need something from me, but because they genuinely want to know. And then I began doing things I had always thought were not for me. I signed up for a small painting class at the community center. On the first day, I felt like a child who had started school late. My hand trembled as I held the brush, and I thought I would quit quickly. But I did not. I sat there, painting clumsy lines, and for the first time in a long while, I did not care whether I was good or not. I simply enjoyed doing something new. That taught me something important. Life is not about how well you do something, but whether you are still willing to try. When we are young, we try because we think we must succeed. When we are older, we try because we want to feel that we are still moving with life. I also learned how to let go of the old script I had carried for so long. The script that says what life should look like at this age, how you should live, how you should feel, what you should expect. But who wrote that script? Not me. And probably not you either. It was passed down from generation to generation without anyone stopping to ask if it was still true. When I allowed myself to rewrite that script, everything changed. I stopped measuring life by what I had lost and started measuring it by what I could still feel. I laughed more. I cried at movies without feeling embarrassed. I allowed myself to be sad on sad days and happy on happy days without judging myself. There are mornings when I wake up with no plans at all. No appointments, no obligations, just me and the new day. That used to frighten me. Now it feels like freedom. I realize that fulfillment does not always come from adding more, but sometimes from stopping the need to fill everything. If you are listening to me and feeling afraid of the years ahead, I want you to know that fear is very human. I was afraid too. I wasted years worrying that life would become smaller. And then I realized it does not become smaller. It becomes quieter, slower, and more honest. The hardest part is not the changing body. The hardest part is changing the way we think about our worth when the things that once defined us are no longer there. But once you do, you realize that old age is not the sad ending people often describe. It is another chapter, not loud, not flashy, but very real. Not long ago, I was sitting alone on a wooden bench in the park near my home. The sunlight was gentle, not harsh, the kind of light you only truly notice when you are no longer rushing. I watched people walk by, young and old, some holding hands, some alone. And for the first time, I realized that I was no longer comparing my life to anyone else's. I was not asking why I did not have this or that. I was just sitting there, feeling okay. That feeling did not come suddenly. It was not a dramatic moment like in the movies. It came very slowly, through ordinary days, through mornings when I made my own coffee and looked out the window, through short phone calls with friends for no special reason other than that we missed each other, through moments when I allowed myself to do what I enjoyed without explaining it to anyone. I used to think a good life was a full life, full of people, full of activity, full of stories to tell. But now I understand that a good life is a life that fits. It fits your energy. It fits your heartbeat. It fits who you are now, not who you used to be or thought you had to become. Perhaps the most important thing I learned after all these years is this: we do not disappear when the things that once defined us change. We become clearer. When we are young, we are wrapped up in roles: wife, husband, parent, provider, the one who has to be strong. When those roles become lighter, you begin to hear your own voice more clearly. At first, that can be frightening because you are not used to it. But if you stay with that quiet long enough, you realize it is not empty. It is waiting for you. I know many people are afraid of the idea of living the later years of life without sex, without the kind of romantic relationship they once had. I was afraid too. But what no one tells us is that connection does not have only one shape. It does not live only in the bedroom. It lives in understanding looks, in stories that are listened to until the end, in the feeling of being yourself without performing. At this age, I no longer need to prove anything. I do not need to be attractive by someone else's standards. I do not need to fit into anyone's idea of happiness. And that gives me a kind of freedom I never had when I was younger. The freedom to say no without guilt. The freedom to say yes to what warms my heart, no matter how small it may seem. There are days when I miss my husband very much. I do not deny that. Missing someone does not disappear just because you learn how to live on. But it no longer consumes me the way it once did. It becomes part of life, like a sad song you can listen to without falling apart. And in those moments, I am grateful that I loved, that I was loved, and that love still lives on in memory, in the way I see the world, in the way I treat others.
If there is one thing I want to say to you, whether you are 40, 60, or 80, it is this: do not let fear of what you think you will lose stop you from fully living what you still have. Life does not end when a chapter closes. It simply asks you to read more slowly, pay more attention, and be more honest with yourself.
I wasted a few years worrying that the best part of my life was behind me, and then I discovered that some of the most beautiful parts came after I let go of what I thought I could not live without, after I stopped trying to live by someone else's story, after I allowed myself to live at my own pace. Now, my life is not loud, it is not grand, but it is real. I have friends who call me not out of obligation. I have days when I learn something new, even if it is just a recipe or an idea. I have moments when I sit in the sun doing nothing at all, and that feels like enough. And most of all, I feel connected, not to one person, but to life itself. If you are sitting there feeling like you have already passed the best part of your life, I hope you pause for a moment and breathe. Life ahead may not look like what you once imagined, but different does not mean worse. Sometimes different simply means deeper, quieter, and far more honest. There is someone out there who believes their life is over because the things that once defined them are gone. If that person is you, I want you to know this: you are not done. You are still here. And as long as you can still feel, still be curious, still be willing to live in your own way, life is still opening in front of you. Thank you for sitting with me and listening. Truly. I hope this story reached you, even just a little. And if it made you feel less alone in your thoughts, then that is enough.